Hello, welcome to the latest how-to webinar from the TPS Southern Region. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about how to read old manuscripts. And by manuscripts, of course, I mean documents that were written by hand, as in not printed books. And there are lots of different types of manuscripts, and we're going to go over some of those different formats of primary sources uh, in this webinar, as well as talk about some of the tricks that you can use to maybe read some of these manuscripts a little bit more easily. I know that they tend to put off a lot of people. We're just going to flat out assume everybody can read cursive for the purposes of this webinar, because reading cursive is, of course, one of the main skills that you need to read old manuscripts. But even if you can't, there are some tricks that you can use to start getting into decoding some of the words. But first of all, we're going to talk about the fact that there are lots of different types of manuscripts with lots of different types of handwriting that the Library of Congress has on its online collections. For example, cuneiform tablets from ancient Sumeria. This one's 4,000 years old and from Iraq. Medieval Western manuscripts, like this illuminated one from France in the 15th century. Here we have one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, written in Hebrew from Israel 2,000 years ago. Here's an example from China from around the 10th century. It's actually got two different kinds of handwriting. There's Donghua uh, pictographs on top and then Chinese on the bottom. So we're not going to be decoding any of these types of manuscripts in today's webinar. We're going to be focusing mostly on documents from U.S. history. So looking at things from the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries in particular. So what are some of the main problems that people come across when they're trying to read old manuscripts? Well, first of all, you have the difficulty of reading the handwriting. Uh, Mostly the cursive handwriting, but also the letter forms might be a little bit different from the kind of cursive that people might write today. I know, and most people don't write cursive anymore, but when they do, it still looks a little different. Abbreviations. The whole point of writing cursive is to write more quickly, and abbreviations help you write even more quickly. And so, what are some of the main abbreviations? Vocabulary. As we all know, vocabulary from the 18th and 19th century when you're reading old American documents tends to be a bit more complicated and a little bit different from what we use in contemporary English. Same thing goes with sentence structure. It tended to be a bit more complex. And so even after you decode letter forms and know what the letters and the words are, sometimes you have to decode them in a different way in terms of getting at their meaning. We'll just kind of touch on some of that today. And then, of course, what if you decode all of that and it's in another language? Then you have to translate after you transliterate, which is something we're actually not going to have time to get to today, but we won't for most of American documents because they're already in English. Let's go ahead and start with an example. This one is from the 17th century. This is a document about Bacon's rebellion in Virginia. And so I'm just going to point out some of the different letter forms that make reading documents from this time period difficult so that we can start recognizing patterns. Because once you can recognize patterns, you can start to read some of these words more easily and quickly. So let's start off with the tall S, which is something that we have probably all seen in manuscripts from early American history, as well as from, European documents as well. The tall S is usually in the middle of words, like for example, here in the word conclusion. And it's not an F. It doesn't have a bar through the whole letter. It might have a knob on one side. If you look, there's an S at the end of the word that looks like our regular little round lowercase s. That's because when it comes at the end of the word, that's what it usually looks like. But inside a word, it's usually the tall S. So here we have a regular looking S at the end of the word years. Now, what about this S? This is also an S at the end of a word, but it looks different from our regular round one. And why is that? Well, if you look at the word bacons and Virginia, you can see they're actually in a different type of handwriting than the rest of it. And that is, it's a more archaic handwriting. It resembles more medieval script, like what you might see in the Gutenberg Bible. And that's just to make those two words stand out and look a little different and make them a bit, they're the most important words in that opening paragraph. Okay, let's look at a different letter form. Let's look at the lowercase e. So here we have in the blue box the year. And it's easy to make out from context clues because it's about the year 1675. But if you look more closely, those don't really look like E's, they look more like O's. So how is it that those are formed? I just have a quick animation to show you the way that these would have been written. You have the bottom bow first, and then they write in the top bow that leads into the following letter. And so sometimes that top loop can look really small, which makes it not even look like a loop at all, which is why that tends to look more like a lowercase o than E in a lot of these words. But once you know that that's an E, it makes reading the rest of this a bit more easy. So I'm just going to go through kind of quickly. About the year 1675 appeared three prodigies in that country, which from the fending disasters were looked upon ob omnibus. Now that's a Latin phrase, ob omnibus. It means by everybody. Presages. That P down here on the bottom word is kind of strange as well. So here we have difficulties with letter forms and vocabulary and other languages. So that's quite a lot that makes this kind of a difficult manuscript to read. Let's look at an example from a different century. Here we have Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptists. And Thomas Jefferson had very neat handwriting, as you can see. Usually very consistent, which helps us in detecting patterns. So let's look at some of the letter forms that were very common around the late 18th, early 19th centuries. But first of all, one thing I want to note about this is when you have handwritten documents, you sometimes it was hard to erase things if they weren't writing in pencil. And so sometimes you get a lot of scribbles and marginal notes. And I love that because you can see the writing process more easily than nowadays when you can just have a document editor on your computer and erase all traces of your earlier words. But so this, the Library of Congress actually worked with the FBI laboratories in the late 90s to try to use technology to read what some of these words were that Thomas Jefferson crossed out. And so in this famous phrase here where he's saying, thus building a wall of separation between church and state, they figured out that the scribbled out word is actually eternal. So what he originally wrote was thus building a wall of eternal separation between church and state, which gives it a bit of a different meaning. But yeah. So let's look at some of his letter forms, though. Up at the top, you can see that the P in the word people does not have a closed loop. It's open on the bottom, and that's actually quite common from this time period. So once you know to look for that, you can also read words like respecting, prohibiting, etc. Another word form, there's two different ways of writing the letter D. And usually at the end of letters, the D is more of a loop with kind of a hook that goes up. And so once you kind of get used to that, then you can make out should and refrained so much more easily. But sometimes he was not very consistent. And so you can see there are actually a couple examples of where the D at the end of the word looks like a regular D. Up in this purple circle on top, there's a cursive lowercase r that the way that he writes it, the lead into the R is more prominent than the actual nose of the R, which is the part that leads into the next letter. And so that looks different from the way a lot of people write their cursive lowercase r's, but once you get used to the way that he writes it in here, then you can detect those patterns and make out some of these words more easily. Like, for example, in the next line, establishment of religion, that first letter is an R, where the lead into the R, where his like pen is just kind of looping over before it goes down, is more prominent than the nose of the R. Another letter form, when he writes his T's differently from his THs. And so that's kind of a common thing too. So when he has a regular lowercase t, there is a clear bar through it. But when it's before an H, the bar is just a little stroke that leads up into the loop of the H. And so that there is in that yellow circle on top. And once you get used to that, then it makes it easier to read every other instance of that on the page. For example, thus inhibited, or this on that little marginal note, which because it's small makes it even harder to read, but you can make out this because you know that that is a T before that H. All right, well, let's go to the browser now. I'm going to stop sharing my PowerPoint and share my browser screen so that we can look at some examples. Now, I am going to put a link to the close reading exercise for the wall of separation letter in the description box below if you want to take a look at it. But I do want to show you another example from Thomas Jefferson before we move on to show you what the Library of Congress also has that might make reading these more difficult. Here is a letter that he wrote to Benjamin Banneker. And yes, the Library of Congress has to verify now that we are human, so just give it a couple seconds. And sometimes you have to X in the box, and sometimes you don't. So this is a case where his very neat handwriting is still difficult to read because the ink has spread over the years and makes it look very fuzzy, and it's harder to distinguish what all of these letter forms are. So this is harder to read because of its age and the type of ink on the type of paper rather than his handwriting. So, but the library sometimes has a lot of tools for you to help you read it. And there is this button up here on the left called Image with Text. And sometimes when you click on that, usually the HTML text version will pop up on this left-hand side. Now, the website's been experiencing some difficulty, so it's saying that it's failed to fetch right now, but it did come up for a second. And so, you might try refreshing till you get that. Or if you click on this PDF choice, here we have the transliteration right here in a PDF form, which is super duper easy for us to read. And you can print this out and use it, etc. I also want to point out how at the very bottom, he closes it, your most obedient, humble servant. And the words obedient and servant are both abbreviated. That's because this was a very common way of closing out letters in the late 18th century. So common, in fact, that there's a song about it in the musical Hamilton, using letters between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. Well, they weren't the only ones who did this. And the way that it looks in the image, if I can zoom in, is you can see the tiny little lowercase cursive t almost as a superscript up here above kind of a period, and that denotes that these are indeed abbreviations. All right, well, let's look at another example of someone who does not have handwriting as nice as Thomas Jefferson, and that is Andrew Jackson. So here we have a letter that he wrote in 1833 to Martin Van Buren, his protege, about the nullification crisis, which of course is a very important issue, a political issue at that time. Now, okay, you're like, okay, great. There's a PDF choice. If we click on it, we can get to a transliteration. Sorry, that's not always going to be the case. This just takes you to a PDF version of the original manuscript. So we are on our own in trying to read this. So if we use some of the tricks that we have just learned, maybe we can start deciphering a few lines of this at least. So right away, up at the left-hand corner, you see the word private. Of course, one of the main differences between manuscripts and printed things is that, manuscripts tend to be of a more personal nature, whereas published things that are printed, are for the public. And so things were handwritten up until, everything was handwritten up until like the 15th century. And then from all of American history, of course, we have the printing press. So why were there still things that were written by hand after the invention of the printing press? Well, this is where you talk about what is the nature of the primary source? Is it a letter? Is it something that would have been written out in the field where they didn't have access to printing technology? So that's where you really have to bring those questions in to your analysis of this type of primary source. And so a lot of letters, of course, were private. And this one is even says that it's private, but you can see that the A in private looks like an O. And so that is a holdover from that way of you know, shortening small vowels so that his stem doesn't come all the way down to the line. It's not an E, but it's also not an O. This one's an A, and that's because of the way that he writes in a hurry, because it makes it go faster to just not fully form that lowercase a. So, and then in his address, he says, "My dear sir." So, dear is an abbreviation right there. Yours of the 9th instant. Instant was a word that they would put after dates, just very common way of writing letters back then. Was handed to me. You can see he's got those round looped D forms, not just at the end of the words like Thomas Jefferson did, but even in the middle of words. By Mr. Wright last night. You can see those A's again. With whom I had some conversation on our general concerns. And I congratulate. You can see that there's a hyphen, but it's not at the end of the first half, it's at the beginning of the second half. Your state and my country for sending us, etc. So between state and my, there's a little plus sign, which is the way he writes and. So I know some of us do that too, like, or you write an ampersand. But that little plus sign you can also see on the line below between the word talents and firmness. So firmness, so there's the plus right here. And firmness is kind of hard to make out the difference between the M and the N, but then you have that tall S followed by the small s at the very, very end. So once you know to look for those, it makes even Andrew Jackson's handwriting a little bit easier to decode, which I will put some links in the description box so you can take a look at some of these more closely. And I hope you can join us next week for our next how-to webinar. Thank you.